Hi, boys and girls. Do I look different? Oh, this was a mask that a friend made for me, like when I go to the grocery store and stuff. So I thought I'd just show it to you today. It matches my class shirt, so I loved it. Anyway, to let me remind you guys, tomorrow is is the day that Miss Slider's class will be on WLOX right before the 6:30 news, and Friday morning my homeroom will be on at the same time. So hope you get to see it, us doing the pledge. Today is the 15th, Wednesday the 15th, so we want to give a shout out to Elena Montgomery, better known as AJ, and Kirsten Palk. And I miss both of you girls and hope you're doing great. Okay, if you're doing the workbook, The Blind Man and the Elephant is the story put into play form. You have questions here. And then don't forget to go to the third page. There is a chart there, and it asks you to give a short summary of the story using your chart. So that should be pretty easy. Okay, we're going to finish the chapter yesterday on the house on the prairie, and then we'll start the chapter moving in. These are the 5 questions I want you to listen for. What is one thing Mr. Edwards can do really well? Number 2, what did Mr. Edwards do when Paul was playing the fiddle? Number 3, what did Paul use for a temporary roof before the real roof got put on? Number 4, the house was finished except for several things besides the roof. Name one other thing that wasn't finished yet, but they went ahead and moved in anyway. And number 5, what did Paul tell Ma to come out and look at toward the end of the last chapter? The last chapter we'll read today, not the very last chapter of the book. Okay, I'm going to read one paragraph I had read yesterday to start off with Mr. Edwards so that you can get the whole picture of him. Early next morning, Mr. Edwards came. He was lean and tall and brown. He bowed to Ma and called her ma'am politely, but he told Laura that he was a wildcat from Tennessee. He wore tall boots and a ragged jumper and a coonskin cap, and he could spit tobacco juice farther than Laura had ever imagined that anyone could spit tobacco juice. He could hit anything he spit at, too. Laura tried and tried, but she could never spit so far or so well as Mr. Edwards could. He was a fast worker, and one day he and Pa built those walls as high as Pa wanted them. They joked and sang while they worked, and their axes made the chips fly. On top of the walls, they set up a skeleton roof of slender poles. Then in the south wall, they cut a tall hole for a door, and in the west wall and the east wall, they cut square holes for windows. Laura couldn't wait to see the inside of the house. As soon as the tall hole was cut, she ran inside. Everything was striped there. Stripes of sunshine came through the cracks in the west wall, and stripes of shadow came down from the poles overhead. The stripes of shade and sunshine were all across Laura's hands and her arms and her bare feet. And through the cracks between the logs, she could see stripes of prairie. The sweet smell of the prairie mixed with the sweet smell of cut wood. Then, as Pa cut away the logs to make the window hole in the west wall, chunks of sunshine came in. When he finished, a big block of sunshine lay on the ground inside the house. Around the door hole and the window holes, Pa and Mr. Edwards nailed thin slabs against the cut ends of the logs. And the house was finished, all but the roof. The walls were solid and the house was large, much larger than the tent. It was a nice house. Mr. Edwards said he would go home now, but Pa and Ma said he must stay to supper. Ma had cooked an especially good supper because they had company. There was stewed jackrabbit with white flour dumplings and plenty of gravy. There was a steaming hot, thick cornbread flavored with bacon fat. There was molasses to eat on the cornbread, but because this was a company supper, they did not sweeten their coffee with molasses. Ma brought out the little paper sack of pale brown store sugar. Mr. Edwards said he surely did appreciate that supper. Then Pa brought out his fiddle. Mr. Edwards stretched out on the ground to listen. But first, Pa played for Laura and Mary. He played their favorite song, and he sang it. Laura liked it best of all because Pa's voice went down deep, deep, deeper in that song. Oh, I am a gypsy king. I come and go as I please. I pull my old nightcap down and take the world at my ease. Then his voice went deep, deep down, deeper than the oldest bullfrogs. Oh, I am a gypsy king. They all laughed. Laura could hardly stop laughing. Oh, sing it again, Pa, sing it again, she cried, before she remembered that children must be seen and not heard. Then she was quiet. Pa went on playing and everything began to dance. Mr. Edwards rose up on one elbow, then he sat up, then he jumped up, and he danced. He danced like a jumping jack in the moonlight, while Pa's fiddle kept on rollicking and his feet kept tapping the ground. Here is a picture of Mr. Edwards dancing while Pa played the fiddle. And there you see the house in the background. Laura's hands and Mary's hands were clapping together and their feet were patting too. You're the fiddlingest fool that ever I see, said Mr. Edwards. He didn't stop dancing. Pa didn't stop playing. He played Money Musk and Arkansas Traveler, Irish Washerwoman, and the Devil's Hornpipe. Baby Carrie couldn't sleep in all that music. She sat up in Ma's lap looking at Mr. Edwards with round eyes and clapping her little hands and laughing. Even the firelight danced, and all around its edge the shadows were dancing. Only the new house stood still and quiet in the dark till the big moon rose and shone on its gray walls and the yellow chips around it. Mr. Edwards said he must go. It was a long way back to his camp on the other side of the woods and the creek. He took his gun and said good night to Laura and Mary and Ma. He said a bachelor got mighty lonesome, and he surely had enjoyed this evening of home life. Play, Ingalls, he said, play me down the road. So while he went down the creek road and out of sight, Pa played. And Pa and Mr. Edwards said, and Laura sang with all their might. Old Dan Tucker was a fine old man. He washed his face in the frying pan. He combed his hair with a wagon wheel and died of the toothache in his heel. Get out the way for old Dan Tucker. He's too late to get his supper. Supper's over and the dishes washed. Nothing left but a piece of squash. Old Dan Tucker went to town, riding a mule, leading a hound. Far over the prairie rang Pa's big voice and Laura's little one, and faintly from the creek bottoms came a long last whoop from Mr. Edwards. Get out of the way for old Dan Tucker, he's too late to get his supper. When Pa's fiddle stopped, they could not hear Mr. Edwards any more. Only the wind rustled in the prairie grasses. The big yellow moon was sailing high overhead. The sky was so full of light that not one star twinkled in it, and all the prairie was a shadowy mellowness. Then from the woods by the creek a nightingale began to sing. Everything was silent, listening to the nightingale's song. The bird sang on and on. The cool wind moved over the prairie, and the song was round and clear above the grasses whispering. The sky was like a bowl of light overturned on the flat black land. The song ended. No one moved or spoke. Laura and Mary were quiet. Pa and Ma sat motionless. Only the wind stirred and the grasses sighed. Then Pa lifted the fiddle to his shoulder and softly touched the bow to the strings. A few notes fell like clear drops of water into the stillness. A pause, and Paul began to play the nightingale's song. The nightingale answered him. The nightingale began to sing again. It was singing with Paul's fiddle. When the strings were silent, the nightingale went on singing. When it paused, the fiddle called to it, and it sang again. The bird and the fiddle were talking to each other in the cool night under the moon. That almost put me to sleep. Okay, the next chapter is called Moving In, and we do see some Indian teepees here, which makes me wonder. The walls are up, Pa was saying to Ma in the morning. We'd better move in and get along as best we can without a floor or other fixings. I must build the stable as fast as I can so Pet and Patty can be inside walls too. Last night I could hear wolves howling from every direction, seemed like, and close too. Well, you have your gun, so I'll not worry, said Ma. Yes, and there's Jack, but I'll feel easier in my mind when you and the girls have good solid walls around you. Why do you suppose we haven't seen any Indians, Ma asked. Oh, I don't know, Pa replied carelessly. I've seen their camping places among the bluffs. They're away on a hunting trip now, I guess. Then Ma called, Girls, the sun's up, and Laura and Mary scrambled out of bed and into their clothes. Eat your breakfast quickly, Ma said, putting the last of the rabbit stew on their tin plates. We're moving into the house today, and all the wood chips must be out. So they ate quickly and hurried to carry all the wood chips out of the house. They ran back and forth as fast as they could, gathering their skirts full of chips and dumping them in a pile near the fire. But there were still chips on the ground inside the house when Ma began to sweep it with her willow bough broom. Ma limped, though her sprained ankle was beginning to get well, but she soon swept the earthen floor, and then Mary and Laura began to help her carry things into the house. Pa was on top of the wall, stretching the canvas wagon top over the skeleton roof of saplings. The canvas billowed in the wind. Paul's beard blew wildly, and his hair stood up from his head as if it were trying to pull itself out. He held on to the canvas and fought it. Here is a picture of Paul trying to get the white canvas cover that had been on the covered wagon to cover the pieces of wood on the roof so that at least if it rained, nothing would fall down on them. But it looks like the wind is blowing and he's having a hard time, huh? Once it jerked so hard that Laura thought he must let go or sail into the air like a bird. But he held tight to the wall with his legs and tight to the canvas with his hands, and he tied it down. There, he said to it, stay where you are and be... Charles, Ma said. She stood with her arms full of quilts and looked up at him reprovingly. And be good, Pa said to the canvas. Why, Caroline, what did you think I was going to say? Oh, Charles, Ma said, you scalawag. Pa came right down the corner of the house. The ends of the logs stuck out, and he used them for a ladder. He ran his hand through his hair so that it stood up even more wildly, and Ma burst out laughing. Then he hugged her, quilts and all. Then they looked at the house, and Pa said, how's that for a snug house? I'll be thankful to get into it, said Ma. There was no door, and there were no windows. There was no floor except the ground, and no roof except the canvas. But that house had good, stout walls, and it would stay where it was. It was not like the wagon that every morning went on in some other place. We're going to do well here, Caroline, Pa said. This is a great country. This is a country I'll be contented to stay in the rest of my life. Even when it's settled up, Ma said. Even when it's settled up, no matter how thick and close the neighbors get, this country'll never feel crowded. Look at that sky. Laura knew what he meant. She liked this place too. She liked the enormous sky and the winds and the land that you couldn't see to the end of. Everything was so free and big and splendid. By dinner time, the house was in order. The beds were neatly made on the floor. The wagon seat and 2 ends of logs were brought in for chairs. Paul's gun lay on its pegs above the doorway. Boxes and bundles were neat against the walls. It was a pleasant house. A soft light came through the canvas roof, wind and sunshine came through the window holes, and every crack in the four walls glowed a little because the sun was overhead. Only the campfire stayed where it had been. Pa said he would build a fireplace in the house as soon as he could. He would hew out slabs to make a solid roof, too, before winter came. He would lay a puncheon floor, a floor made of wood, and make beds and tables and chairs. But all that work must wait until he had helped Mr. Edwards and had built a stable for Pet and Patty. When all that's done, said Ma, I want a clothesline. Pa laughed. Yes, and I want a well. After dinner, he hitched Pet and Patty to the wagon, and he handed a tubful of water from the creek so that Ma could do the washing. You could wash clothes in the creek, he told her. Indian women do. If we wanted to live like Indians, you